Hello, everyone. Jenny and I are here today to talk about two very important things. We're basically talking about Saturn moving into Pisces. We are also going to talk about the full moon because they happen side by side. Now, just to introduce you to us, Jenny is from hiddenpathastrology.com. You can find her there. And I am Laurie of astrolore.org. You can find me there. Together, we've created this YouTube channel called AstroPath. So this is where you will find the two of us working together. So before we dive into our topic, please subscribe to this channel. If you like what you see here, share it. Leave us comments. We would love to hear from you. We're going to talk today about these two important issues, and we're going to talk about each individual rising sign. If you don't know your birth time, you don't know your rising sign, just watch the piece that is about your sun sign. You'll get good information there. If you do know your rising sign, watch both your sun sign and your rising sign. You'll get a lot of information there. Okay, so as far as the introduction, I think I said everything I need to. What am I missing, Jenny?
Oh, I think you hit all the key points, Laurie.
Oh, good.
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
Well done.
So what are we going to dive into first?
Well, let's just talk about the dates here. So what we have is a full moon on March 7th, 2023. This is, we have 7:40 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So you need to adjust that for your time zone. And then just 55 minutes later, Saturn goes into Pisces. So it's really, really interesting to have such a major shift of an important planet going into a new sign that is going to be in for a few years, happening at almost the same moment as a full moon. We decided to do it together because it really kind of brings in this nice counterpoint of, hey, there's this full moon in the opposite sign of what Saturn is moving into. So it kind of gives you this nice, clear awareness into what is happening. And we just thought it made sense to do it together because it brings those two things neatly into counterpoint with each other.
So let me ask you a question. For those people who are watching this that don't really, that haven't studied astrology for 100 years and don't know all about this, why is Saturn's movement from one sign to another so important? Why is it more important? Why is it more important, for instance, than when Venus moves into a new sign or Mercury? Why is it so important?
Good point. Yeah, and Saturn only changes sign every 2.5 to 3.5 years. It's somewhere in there. It's a pretty slow-moving planet. It's the last visible planet that we can see with the naked eye, and it takes about 30 years for it to go around the sun. So we kind of have these like increments with Saturn, and it breaks down into these 7-year cycles. But basically, it changes signs every few years. So when it happens, it kind of is a big game changer. Yeah. And on a personal level, it's going to enter a whole new area of your chart. So it's really going to bring in these different themes and topics to light.
Yeah. I like to think about it. I like to think about the difference between Saturn moving into a new sign and, one of the inner planets moving into the sign as, the quicker a planet moves through an area, the less of an impact it has because it moves in and it moves out again. I think of it like a house guest. If a house guest comes and spends a weekend and leave, it doesn't take you that much to clean up after them. If they come in and stay there for 3 years, like Saturn does, they've changed your life. Venus might spend a few weeks. Mercury might spend a few weeks. Mars recently spent quite a few months in a sign, but still Saturn spends 3 whole years. So that is a house guest that you have to really contend and learn a lot from.
Well, that's a roommate. That's a whole different source.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. Really I like that. Somewhere I read that. So it wasn't my personal idea, but it really stuck with me because it is. Yeah. Saturn really changes the environment that it's moving through in a very big way.
Yeah. I mean, to illustrate that, it's like Saturn has recently been in Aquarius, right? For several years. And so all of us have been receiving some sort of lesson around whatever that is. It depends what house it fell in your chart. But we've all been learning things about Aquarius these past like 3 years. And so this shift is going to, it represents a major tone shift in your life. So.
And one of the things to think about too is, as Saturn's entering Pisces, yes, it's leaving Aquarius. What did you learn during that 3 years? What's Aquarius? What kind of lessons has Saturn taught us in Aquarius? Aquarius is a very highly intellectual sign about big picture items, big cultural changes. So we've been really learning a lot on that level over the last 2.5 to 3 years.
Yeah. And it's so different for it now to drop into Pisces. And this is one of the beauties of the zodiac wheel, is that every sign is a response essentially to the one before it, to build balance. And so once we've been up high in the sky with these, as you said, these big intellectual ideas, these like broad views and that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, now how do you feel about all of it?
Right.
And it's like, now we're just going to drop you into the emotional part of all this. What does this shift mean? So this is a major game changer. And Saturn, Saturn's not super thrilled to be in Pisces necessarily. It's going out of its zone. Like it rules Aquarius, it rules Capricorn. So for 6-7 years, it's been in its own signs, kind of cruising through, and now whoops, it's going into this sign that likes to not have boundaries and to be super expansive and to deal with all these like high level things like the unconscious and these things that don't have boundaries by definition. So Saturn going into this sign, it's really going out of its territory into a whole new zone. So,
and it's when we think about Saturn transits, we always want to think about the importance of, okay, when was Saturn last in Pisces? And, people who have Saturn in their natal chart in Pisces are now coming to their Saturn return, whether it be their first Saturn return, their second, or their third. People who were born between 1993 and 97, approximate dates, have Saturn, are coming into their first Saturn return. People born between 1964 and 1966, thereabouts in that time frame, are coming to their second Saturn return. People born between 1935 and 37 are coming to their third Saturn return. And these are very important points of maturity and stabilization, because that, of course, is what Saturn, the gifts of Saturn are stability and a structure. And in Pisces, it's not easy to build a structure because, like you said, Pisces doesn't want those boundaries that Saturn insists on. So it's a little tricky.
Yeah, it's interesting because I like to think about Saturn as the necessity for growth. I mean, it is, we all have to grow in our consciousness throughout our lives. It's not like it stops, like it just ends. I mean, the fundamental human orientation to life is that of growth. And Saturn is, the necessity. It brings in this need for effort, this need for discipline, this need to work with essentially the boundaries of your own ego. And so by definition, it's challenging, you think about when you're a kid and you'd have growing pains. This is the growing pains of the soul, and Saturn represents that necessary growth that we're all being required to do to be human, essentially. So it is associated with difficulty and challenge and sometimes pain. And that's part of its character. But the truth of it is that's when you resist the lesson. If you recognize there's a lesson being delivered and you open to that lesson, you go, oh, I'm getting lessons. It's the resistance that causes the pain. It is not a requirement. It's a choice in a way.
The requirement is to do the work that Saturn puts in front of you. If you're unwilling to do the work, because Saturn is going to require you to do some work. It's the authoritative teacher. It gives you the lesson plan. Here's the lesson plan. Are you going to do this lesson, or are you going to, just ignore it and hope it goes away? Well, it won't go away. It'll dig down, and you got to face and work with your challenges. It's interesting. Yeah, I just was thinking about my son just had Saturn sit on his sun, and I watched the process of him trying to resist the lesson. When he hit a major at that transit, he hit a major health crisis. And I watched him try to resist it, and he was so angry. And then I watched him, not literally, but on the phone talking with him, I watched him accept it and take on the job. And I can see how it immediately he's grown up so much in just a few months' time. And that's, we have to take on those lessons. How can we fight that? Fighting it, what's going to happen? You're just going to end up angry and, in a gutter somewhere. But you gotta do your work. And Saturn is the work. Bottom line.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a really good story of just like, that is what happens to all of us. We want to fight and resist, like, oh, I don't want to change. I don't want to do something new. Like, I'm fine how I am. And then, and even if you're not fine how you are, it's like we cling to that old structure, the old shell. And what Saturn really is asking of us is like, nope, you're gonna have to face, and you've got to accept where you are now. And it's not it's an obligatory thing. It is. It is just not.
And once you've taken it on, it feels really good. You feel better once you've reached those levels of maturity. You understand your life and your process better. I also remember a client of mine many years ago. She was so scared of her first Saturn return. She didn't want to grow up. She just didn't want to grow up, bottom line. And she was so resistant and so like, oh no, I don't want to. And, I didn't meet with her for a long time. And when I finally met with her after that Saturn return, she was so much more solid and stable in herself. Saturn lessons are a great gift when we're willing to do the work.
Yeah, because it is exactly about being willing to do the work. It's really the consciousness you bring to it, because that's kind of what we're talking about here. Yeah. And the negative associations with Saturn largely do come from just not being able to be conscious with it and trying to run away, trying to bury it, trying to blame other people for
that's a big
problems and issue. Yeah, that's a sure sign. If there's blaming going on, and unfortunately it means that there's some looking within that you really, really need to do. And I know some of these things might sound a little like, oh, I've heard that before, but when you really reckon with it and recognize it, it's true. And it's what's happening. And it's not to say that if you embrace everything, it's going to be easy. Like, no, it isn't. It just means that you're going to remove that resistance that causes even more pain than is necessary. That's really why it's kind of earned this reputation, at least in my opinion, of being this sort of the malefic, like that it's going to bring bad things. Well, that just depends how it's going to bring bad things if you're the CEO of a company and you're being a total asshole, and finally your employees are like, we're done,
Yeah. And that's where, Saturn is also considered the planet of karma. The consequences of our actions are, part of this whole issue with Saturn. When Saturn moves into a certain area of your life, you have to face the consequences of your actions building up to that. So do your work, bottom line. Is there more you want to say about this before we move into the individual stuff, or are we ready to do that?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Pisces. I don't think we've really addressed Pisces,
That's right.
And just as a tone, like, okay, we've talked about Saturn being this teacher and embracing these lessons and so on, but what is the lesson? What's the lesson plan? And going into Pisces, there's a few different ways we can look at it. I think one of my favorite ways of looking at it is to talk about lessons in empathy. Empathy is not something you're born with necessarily. Some people are more empathetic than others, but empathy is something that you can learn. It is a skill that you can work with. It is a skill you can put effort towards and become more empathetic, to walk in other people's shoes. Essentially, it's just simply the respectful understanding of what other people might be feeling. It's a deceptively simple concept. That's kind of my just real quick take on it, is like, oh, lessons in empathy in some area of your life.
Right.
Laurie, I know you have some really nice ones.
Well, I was thinking about it as materializing your dreams is one way to think about it, because Saturn is the materialization, the putting up a structure, and Pisces is so much about where we just are expansive in our unconscious. Yeah, it's hard to hold on to Pisces. Pisces is intangible. By its very nature, it is intangible. It is our dream life. So materializing your dreams, putting structures around your dreams in whatever area has Pisces in your chart, with Saturn moving in there, you can really work with Saturn to materialize what your dreams are in that area. Surrendering to your dreams and building a container for magic. Magic is also a Pisces thing. Yeah, and Saturn insists that we build a container for things. And yeah, our magic doesn't, but magic does need a container. Honestly, you know, it tends to, yeah, it really needs a container. And so Saturn is really here to offer us the gift of building a container to build magic in that area of our lives. I think there's, I personally, I'm excited about this movement.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think it's easy. There's sort of pros and cons, you know, like on the sort of con side, it's like Pisces, like, but I just want to be like boundary free and like float and be ethereal and dream big. And Saturn's like, well, I like to have, you know, some structure and some walls, you know, and you can see where the two are at odds with each other, so opposite. But when you really think about it, like you said, like you've got to have structure. If you really want to materialize your dreams, you've got to have structure. You've got to have a plan. You've got to have an understanding of like the nuts and bolts. Like, what are you going to do in the material world? Like, how are you going to make this work? How are you going to get other people on board? I mean, these are all things that works with, you know, so there's an art to it. If you can learn to work these energies together, it's like there's a lot to be harvested here, and essentially to build your dreams, like to build these things that you have these ideas about. So, and I think to that end, I did want to just briefly mention the full moon, if you're ready to cover that.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Right,
sure.
Let's show the chart for that real quick.
Okay.
Here. Yeah. And then we'll move to individual impacts. So this is the chart for Saturn moving into Pisces. You can see that it's 0 Pisces. And totally opposite on the other side of the chart, you've got that moon, which is just barely being exactly full. 55 minutes before. So just what I wanted to get across about this chart is look how opposite that moon is from everything. I mean, it really is it's in this much more practical, skill-oriented sign of Virgo. And it's such a counterpoint to all that. That Pisces, which is as big as the ocean.
Right.
What are your thoughts on this full moon, Laurie?
Well, it brings in it brings in an awareness of the service that's required, or the effort that's required, or the skill that needs to be developed in order to materialize those dreams, maybe.
Yeah, no, I like that. It brings in this like little earthy counterpoint.
Yeah.
I mean, Virgo's so nuts and bolts. Virgo's like, hey, those people over there are hungry. Like, I'm gonna go buy soup ingredients and make soup and bring them soup. I mean, it just gets right to work, right?
In some ways, it feels like Saturn moving into Pisces, because it brings that practical effort involved to the topics of Pisces.
Yeah, it's kind of a mirror. It really is just like a mirror.
It really is
of the opposite thing, you know. I like to bring this in too, because I do think sometimes full moons can be like trigger points, you know, like that it's just this very fleeting moment, but yet it can bring on these much larger cycles. It can literally be the kind of like the match that lights a fuse, you know, like the fuse is already there and everything's there, but then it's this little thing that sparks it almost. So I do think of the moon as like bringing this light, and like what is being illuminated by the light of the moon in this moment? What is it showing us? And it's showing, I mean, I think it's this gives you a moment to consider, like, what is this, 3-year plus lesson in
Right.
compassion? Like, what are my dreams? Like, what is a practical step I can take today
Right.
to work with it?
Yeah. What are the skills that I need to develop? And the ability to, in this moment of the full moon, see what those skills are that you need to develop.
Yeah, I like that.
And then, just as a real quick, you brought up earlier, is that Uranus is in a trine aspect to that full moon, a very close trine aspect. So that's like, that's it. To me, I feel like, okay, so the full moon illuminates the need of the skill to be developed, and Uranus offers the excitement to actually get it done. It's just a spark of excitement that's added to the situation.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. I mean, in a trine aspect too, it's a free flow of energy. It's like, hey, here's all this energy to put into that. The other thing I like about it is because Uranus is a transpersonal planet, it sort of is this request of like, think bigger, or recognize how your story has a role to play in the greater fabric of everything else. I like that. It brings in that kind of larger than life component to all of this. And also being in an earth sign, it brings in, it's what's happening in Taurus. This is tangibility. This is resources. All of those things being fed into this.
Right. Yeah. So that Uranus just really wakes us up to the process, to the counterpoint, the what's being illuminated, the practical side of it. There's so much Pisces right now, and there's been a lot of Pisces here for a while, and Pisces can be so impractical. So this full moon shows us some practicality. Saturn moving in there is going to push us into some serious practicality around what is normally considered intangible and all of that.
Yeah,
I'm excited. I'm super excited about this.
Yeah, I just think it's really fascinating. This is happening, the Saturn moving into Pisces happening the same day as this full moon. I mean, almost within the same hour, actually. I think it's just such a statement of like, hey, take a look at this. Really think about how you want to apply this practically. We need to work with this intangibility in a more practical sense. So
absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else?
I don't think so. I think we should move on to personal impacts. What do you think?
Okay, I think you're right. I think that's a good idea.
All right.
All right. So we are going to start with those of you with Aries rising. Now, what you want to think about, those of you with Aries rising, what have you been learning over the past 2.5 to 3 years with Saturn moving through your 11th house? You want to think about what you've learned about what you receive from community, how you receive love from others. What have you learned there? What gift, what has been developed in that area? Now, so think about that. Think about the gift you've received. And now with Saturn moving into this 12th house, think about what you need to learn. How, what's your dream? What's your idea of your unconscious and how you could develop your unconscious patterns in order to support you? This is an area where you really need to develop some structure and learn some tools for managing your unconscious mind. That sounds a little tricky, and you might need a therapist to help you along the way. But you can do your own inner work. This is very much a time for the next 3 years of really doing your inner work. So what do you feel like you need to develop there? How do you need to structure your understanding of that part of yourself? So once you've thought about that, I want you to think about how the full moon gives us a point of reference, as Jennie's been saying, that Virgo moon right opposite all these Pisces planets gives us a point of reference. What practical skill do you need to learn in the area of your day-to-day routine life that would help support this process? That's an interesting way to think about it, isn't it, Jennie?
Yeah, I really think that's the kind of key to just this very initial first phase of Saturn moving into Pisces is what can I do right now, right out of the gate? And so with the
Right.
Virgo moon, it's something tangible. It's a
Right.
task. It's some small step that you can touch or feel or do or really work with. That's giving you that first clue into how do I work with these two emotion plus structure. That's kind of what it's
Right.
allowing you to do. So I think that
Right.
that's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with Aries rising, yep, those 12th house lessons, this is a deep part of your life.
Mm-hmm.
This is where you develop compassion for yourself,
Yeah.
and you're suffering. If you're suffering with something, struggling with something, that is just a sign of like, okay, this is, I'm on the right track. Like, this is the work
Right.
that I need to do because it's the
Right.
12th house. And really it's about that developing compassion for yourself and others. And guess what? That 6th house where the full moon is where you do that right now, today, on your meditation mat,
Right.
or out in
Yes.
the world. You want to beat yourself up. Nope. You offer yourself kindness instead.
Right. And this is, another thing to think about always when Saturn is in in the 12th house, it's heading in 3 years, it's going to go into your first house. So you're preparing for really bringing yourself out in a more authoritative way. This work that you're doing behind the scenes is very important. And if you're approaching your first Saturn return, this won't mean too much. But if you're approaching your second or your third Saturn return, think about the lessons that you learned between 1993 and 97. Those, because that was the last time Saturn went through Pisces. What occurred in your life during that period of time, there'll be a reflection of it now. You're on a higher level of that same learning curve now. So yeah, sit down on your meditation mat and make it a daily practice, or go out in the woods on a daily, whatever it is, some daily practice that is practical and grounded, that will help you in this first steps of understanding what it is you're facing for the next 3 years, what the lessons are. You're starting a new, when Saturn moves into a new area, you're starting a whole new study program that's going to last you for almost 3 years. And this study program for you is really stabilizing your kind of loose unconscious patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really
Oh, it's
like that. I think
beautiful.
that's great. It might be challenging, but it is a great opportunity for
Yeah.
the start of that new cycle that's ahead of you 3 years down the road. So I think it's a really
Yeah.
nice way to put it.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. So
Okay.
moving on, we're going to talk now about those of you with Taurus rising. Now, with Taurus rising, the Saturn's movement is into the 11th house. But before we talk about that, I want you to ask yourself, what you've learned over the past 3 years while Saturn moved through your 10th house. What did you learn about your place in the bigger world? What did you learn about your vocation or your career, or just how you're seen in the outer world? What did you learn there? What gift have you received there that you can now bring into the work that is upcoming as Saturn moves into the 11th? Okay, so now what you're going to ask yourself is, what do you need to learn here? What do you need to learn in terms of building or supporting the dream you have of a expansive, loving community? Those of you with Taurus rising have a fantasy about the perfect community. You probably do. And this is a time to put some structure around that. What are the first steps that you want to take for that? And that's where we're going to look at the full moon, the practical steps that moon in Virgo offers. And this would be, we can think of this as, the tasks of creativity, the task of showing love in a practical way. And that will support the first beginning steps of this new school of community that you're coming into.
Yeah, I really like this idea of, in order to understand more about how you receive, what do you need to do? You need to give. You know, so it's like, if you have this dream of this community that you would like to see, which those of you I know with Taurus rising, those are folks with those kinds of dreams. The answer is to show up with that practicality, that plan, that idea with, you know, nuts and bolts. Like step one, hey, I have this great idea. I have these two people in mind. What if you took on this task? These other two people. I mean, it's that sort of thing. This idea of showing up with your community with this plan and this ability to show those first tangible steps along the way to making it a reality. And it's just a really nice back and forth with Taurus rising in those areas of life, of the giving and receiving of love and how they work together. And your personal effort combining with that of the group. So it's a really nice interplay. I like this one.
Yeah. So for the next 3 years, you're building that dream of that community. That's your job. And your task to start it out is to get creative and give. And for those of you, you know, if you're just coming up on your first Saturn return, this won't be terribly relevant. But for those of you who are older, I want you to think back to the lessons that you were learning around community between 1993 and 97. Whatever, because that's the last time Saturn went through this area, was between 1993 and 97 for you. What did you learn then? And how is that relevant to where you are now? How can you now build on what you learned at that time? So there's a connection between these times. This is the beginning of a cycle. It's the ending of a cycle that started then, the beginning of a new cycle. So what you started then is now, I think I just twisted that whole statement up. But hopefully I made some sense. It's a reflection of that period of time at any rate.
And also, like, that period of time very likely was some big growth period, right, around how you dealt with community. And so you're looking at that again, and there usually is kind of an echo of whatever that pattern was before all these years later. But that's what, I mean, Saturn's really dealing with the growth of consciousness. And for that reason, you end up having to slough off things that are maybe harder to part with. It can be difficult, challenging, maybe painful. But boy, it is really teaching you how to expand your consciousness and grow in a new way. I mean, Saturn is just such an incredible teacher planet that way. And so in this little period of time, we're in Pisces seasons, we have a full moon. I mean, we've kind of been in this little microcosm of, like, what does Pisces represent for each of us? The development of compassion and empathy, the dream, all of those kinds of things. The full moon, you get to think about the next tangible step, which is actually really helpful.
Absolutely. And, you know, wherever Saturn moves, I always think of it also. There's 3 things that I always ask myself when I see Saturn moving into a house is, first, you got to face reality here. What is your community now? Face the reality of it. Be accountable. Don't blame the state of it on somebody else. If it's not how you want it, don't blame it on somebody else. Be accountable. And then take responsibility for building the dream that you want it to be. That's bottom line. Okay?
Just like that.
Just like that. Just like you've got 3 years. You've got 3 years to work through this. And this beginning point, I think that full moon is just so awesome to bring that into the conversation. Okay. So now, for those of you with Gemini rising, this puts the movement of Saturn into Pisces. This brings Saturn into your 10th house. Now, before we talk about Saturn in your 10th house, let's just think about when Saturn moves into one house, it's moving out of another. So it has been moving through your 9th house for approximately 2.5 to 3 years. Saturn's been moving through that 9th house. What have you learned? What have you learned in regards to your seriousness of your higher understanding, your worldview, your belief system. What have you learned? Do you now feel solid in your worldview? I assume you've probably learned a lot there. So now you take that understanding and you move it into the 10th house, which is the area of your career, your vocation, your reputation, how the world sees you. And you want to ask yourself, what do you need to learn in the next 3 years in this area? What do you need to do to materialize the dream? Those of you with Gemini rising, you've got Pisces on this 10th house cusp. There's a dreaminess, a lack of clarity, maybe. You might have a dream of what you want your career to be. You might also just be confused. Pisces can do that as well. So Saturn moving in here, it's like, okay, we've got to stabilize this dream, or we've got to clarify this lack of clarity. So how do we do this? The first step I love with this full moon, this suggests that it gives us that counterpoint, as Jennie has been talking about, the counterpoint of a practical task right out of the gate. Saturn moves into that house and you have a practical awareness that there is something around your home and family that needs to be managed in order to begin that work.
Yeah, I really like this one. Yeah, I mean, Gemini rising, it's really interesting because it sort of implies, it does imply that you have this real transcendent potential around your career. Like you more than other people can bring, the kind of the nuts and bolts, the profession into this elevated place. Like you have a vision that maybe other people in your workplace can't quite share easily. So you kind of carry that weight. And what's so nice about Saturn moving there is it's going to give you this gravitas. It's going to give you this oomph in this area of life to the degree to which you can embrace it consciously. It's going to give you, it brings authority to your profession. So you're getting this opportunity to bring authority, but about this transcendent dream space, this idea for, it could be different things, your idea for empathy in the workplace, how to be more compassionate to one another. It could be more imaginative, artistic type of situation, because Pisces implies that as well. But I think it's an extra nice placement because it brings you this tangibility in a place that you could really use it in the profession, right? So I like that.
Saturn moving into the 10th house, on a real practical level, it generally, suddenly you'll have more responsibilities on your job, or heaven forbid, you'll lose your job. If it's the wrong job for you, it's time to get rid of it, quite honestly. Wherever Saturn moves, face reality, be accountable, take responsibility. Your career path becomes quite serious as Saturn moves in here. You've learned so much about your worldview, and now bring that understanding into what you do in the world, the work you do in the world.
And I like how you brought in with the full moon piece. It's such an important counterpoint because you can't possibly think about your work life without thinking about where you go when you're done with work for the day. Whatever your job is in the world, whatever your profession is, you have some sort of home life. And so it's really this implication of have a grounding in your home life. Like check in with that, like make sure that you feel like you're, pretty solid in your home life. It might also bring attention to the fact that you need to make some sort of change about where your home is, just because that full moon's there. So think about that. What is the question that you want to ask yourself? Like, what tasks do you need to do in your home life in order to allow you to embrace this new level of authority in your work life? You can't really have one without the other. So think about that. And that it's nice because it kind of brings in this, I don't know, it kind of goes, like this exhale of like, where do I put my head at night? Where do I sleep at night? How am I working with that?
I really love how this Saturn's movement just coincides with this full moon. It just really brings in such an interesting awareness with that full moon, an awareness of the importance of the polarity.
Agreed. Yeah.
It really is. And the other thing I want to say before we move on is that if you're, just coming up to your first Saturn return, which would mean your Saturn is in Pisces, then this won't mean a whole lot to you because you were too young. But if you're older than that, I want you to think about what was going on in your life approximately between 1993 and 97, because that was the last time Saturn was in Pisces. So when you think about 93 to 97, you were learning a lot in this area. You were in a similar place. These cycles, they're cycles. So you are beginning a new cycle now from one that began then. There will be echoes. So if you think about what you learned during that period of time and how that understanding that you've carried with you for all these years can now support a more profound learning and understanding now. So what's your dream of your career and how are you going to manifest it? That's the question. And that's the work for the next 3 years.
All right.
Okay.
Exciting.
Yeah, I love this. Okay, so now we're going to move on to those of you with Cancer rising. And here we have Saturn has moved into your 9th house. So those of you with Cancer rising have Pisces holding that space of the 9th house. But before we think about that, let's think about where Saturn has been. For the past approximately 2.5 to 3 years, Saturn's been moving through your 8th house. So you want to ask yourself, what have you learned in the past 3 years about how you navigate the boundaries, expectations, and baggage of other people in your life? What have you learned through those past 3 years? Because that's the kind of school you've been in for the past 3 years. Now you take that understanding and it's sort of like as Saturn leaves one house, one sign, it leaves you with a gift. So you've got a gift of, you've really learned a lot on how to manage those deep issues in relationship. Now Saturn moves into the 9th house and you want to ask yourself, what do you need to learn with that understanding of other people's baggage? What do you now need to really learn to understand about your own worldview? There's a connection between those two. Yeah. So what do you need to learn about your own worldview? Because that's the school you're going to be in for the next 3 years. You've got a tendency to be kind of a little lack of reality there. You've got your rose-colored glasses on, your worldview is a particular dreamy space. But now you've got to really get practical here. Saturn wants to build a container and specify what your worldview and get clear about it. You got to get a lot deeper and not just make assumptions on your worldview. You've got to really understand it. So with this full moon, the counterpoint here, what do you think that is, thinking about this full moon as an awareness of how to begin this school. Like you've started this school, you've got to learn about structuring your worldview. The awareness that the moon in Virgo brings you is, what is it, Jennie? I'm going to throw that at you.
In this case, it's the smaller level of just how you're going to talk about it. Right. It's pretty simple. Exactly. I mean, the 3rd house really deals with how you communicate. It deals with how you move through your environment. And so much of that is through your words, your mindset, and your words. So with the full moon there, it's just asking for you to articulate what lessons do you want to learn about your worldview? And it's time to articulate that and also use that, write it down. Yeah. I mean, writing is a really, really helpful thing with that 3rd house. So this is, I think anyone with Cancer rising, it's a good opportunity to sit down and think about I don't know, question your worldview, question your critical thinking. It's time to, quite frankly, confront fears about, expressing your worldview to other people around you. But that also means confronting your fears, but it also means being compassionate towards others as well, and like taking in other people's points of view. I mean, there's a real, with this, the third and the ninth, I mean, this is like listening and taking in and learning and developing, and then expressing your viewpoint to others.
Right.
So you're really working with both ends of that at the same time. So I think that Virgo full moon is super nice, because it really kind of brings it right down to this practical level of what are you going to talk about?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, really understanding that over the next 2.5 or 3 years, your worldview is going to change. And if you try to hold on to exactly the way your worldview is today, that's not going to be easy. You've got to, it's not going to be good. And the other thing with this being in the 9th house, in 3 years approximately, is coming right to the top of your chart. So you are also preparing for 3 years from now, when Saturn reaches that top point and goes into your 10th house, whatever your career goals are, you have this 3-year period to really prepare. You've got 3 years to prepare. I love it. When I see Saturn moving into somebody's 9th house, it's like, okay, well, whatever your ideas are of your career, you've got the next 3 years to prepare through education, through, gathering information in those big worldview areas. Your worldview is going to change in order to support the career that will really be expanded upon in 3 years. Or further developed.
I mean, and to that end, I know, Laurie, you've been bringing up the time period between 1993 and 1997. Yes. Like, if you are old enough for that to have more meaning than you just being a child, that time period gives you a little cheat sheet into how did you handle it last time? What changed about your worldview last time that Saturn was in Pisces? Because that's when it was. So it's a good time to reflect on that, because I think there's a lot of kind of spiral development, and sometimes it feels circular, but it's not. It's really a spiral that moves forwards. So you're kind of on a different rung, or a different level, but of that same part of the spiral where you're learning to really work with your own worldview and express it. So
anything personal around that for you?
Oh no, not at all. Oh no, I remember I went for that time frame. For me, I was in college, and I was a little bit lost and confused about what direction to follow. I do remember that, and my response was to ski a hell of a lot. So I skied my ass off.
Interesting.
But I also think of Pisces as water. I think snow is the Pisces water. So it's interesting.
It's interesting.
Flow, right?
You were studying, you were in school, which is such a 9th house. You were working on developing a worldview.
And getting good at skiing.
And getting good at skiing. Maybe that be, anyway. So do you feel the reflection?
Oh, you mean at the full moon?
No, the reflection from 93 to 97. Do you feel that, as far as time goes, do you feel that reflected now?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think a time of a lot of expansion, but also understanding of Pisces. And there is such an important piece about being able to walk in other people's shoes and understand that we're all connected, whether you want to admit that or not. We are all profoundly connected. And this gives you time to really work at that and see that. And I always think of that astronaut's picture of just the planet, one round planet from space, and that's what it is. And it's watery, it's blue, so it's very Piscean.
Yes, it certainly is. The other thing I just want to throw out is the whole idea of wherever Saturn moves, face reality, be accountable, take responsibility. So when Saturn moves into your 9th house, you've got to take responsibility for what your worldview is. If your worldview is different than everyone around you, you've got to face that reality and stop pretend, because a lot of us, if we find ourselves in a family or whatever, in a community where everyone thinks alike, it's not easy to have a profoundly different worldview. So and with Pisces there, you can easily put your head in the sand and pretend it's not. But you've got to face reality wherever Saturn moves. How is your worldview different? And how are you going to be accountable and responsible for what you believe? This is really, the ninth house is what you believe on a bigger level. So it's a job. It's a job to do. And thank you.
It is a job.
Okay. So now we're going to move from Cancer rising to those of you with Leo rising. And this is moving that Saturn into your 8th house. So before we talk about Saturn moving into your 8th house, let's just think about, for the past almost 3 years, Saturn's been moving through your 7th house. So 7th house is one-on-one relationship. You've been in Saturnian relationship school for almost 3 years. What have you learned about who you are in relationship, what you need in relationship, and how your partners, whether they be intimate partners or business partners, how they fit for you? So you've learned a lot about that. You've probably stabilized your relationships in a lot of ways over that period of time. So now, as Saturn moves into the 8th house, you need to think about the difference between the 7th and the 8th house. The 8th house is the deeper levels of intimate connections. It's where we really bump into the need for our own boundaries, because it's where we bump into other people's values that may be different from our own, other people's baggage. So we bump into some difficult interpersonal issues in the 8th house. And while Saturn's moving through there for the next 3 years, this is where you really need to pay attention and learn a lot. So you're now in school about learning about how to navigate that space between yourself and others, right? So now the other thing is thinking about that moon. And with that full moon happening at the same time as Saturn's moving in there, the way we're thinking about it is that this is an awareness point. This is kind of giving us a clue as Saturn first moves in there. What do we need to pay attention to? What practical task can we start this process out with? What do you think that would be in this situation, Jennie?
Well, it's so interesting with the full moon. It always brings in a polarity. So here we're looking at, it's pretty simple. How do you value yourself? Because it's from that point of how you value yourself that you know what boundaries to set and how to work with the values of other people. I mean, it's very, it's sort of very straightforward in this case. And with Virgo there, it's quite practical. I mean, Virgo certainly has that reputation of being really critical, and that's going to be the challenge here, depending on what other things are in your natal chart, Leo rising. But I think it really is like an assessment, like, how am I doing with this? How do I value myself? Of course, this extends to your finances. I mean, you can't really separate, unfortunately, your self-worth and your finances are reflections of one another, different levels of the same thing. So it might be one of those topics. But we are looking at very practical, tangible things that have to do with how you value yourself as your starting point. Because as Saturn moves into that 8th house, it demands that you understand where you end and where other people begin. You need to have an understanding of that in order to do it skillfully. It doesn't, you're not going to be doing this skillfully right out of the gate immediately, right? I mean, it depends again on your natal chart, but important time to develop compassion for yourself and others, right? Because that's where the kindness comes in, and this is what I need to do, and this takes nuance, skill. This isn't just an obvious thing that you know how to do immediately. So they work together very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. And thinking about wherever Saturn moves, we have to, I feel like I'm saying this over and over. I guess I am for each sign, but as Saturn moves into a new area of the chart, we need to face reality in that area. We need to be accountable and we need to take responsibility. So what does that look like? It's like, okay, face reality. How are your boundaries? Are they supporting your ability to navigate other people's stuff while holding yourself steady? Not getting lost. It's so easy with Pisces on that cusp. It's easy to just kind of put on the rose-colored glasses and assume everything is lovely. But we need boundaries, and Saturn is going to support you in building necessary boundaries to support this area. The eighth house is also, it's about shared resources. So if you have a dream about shared connections, deep, intense, shared connections with other people, you've got to have the boundaries, or it's just, it's a mess. It's a mess.
Yeah,
so
you need to have structure. Yeah.
Right, you need structure in order to have that dream of a shared future together. You've got to have the structure and the boundaries. So that's what you're going to be learning for the next 2.5 or 3 years. Yeah. If you're old enough that this makes any sense, if you were just born in 1993, this isn't going to make any sense to you. But if you're older than that, think about the period of time between 1993 and 1997, because that's the last time Saturn moved through this area. And if you think about what you were learning during that period of time, it will help you understand where you are now. You're in the same school on a higher level. You've been through this process once. You're in this process again many years later, but you are now learning a higher level of how to build boundaries that support your ability to navigate and work with other people.
Yeah, and Saturn in the eighth house it's challenging because it's hard to kind of describe and it's hard to explain easily. But there is some very important lessons, because what this is doing for Leo rising is preparing you for a much more public part of your life, because Saturn, after it leaves Pisces, it's going to move up into the higher parts of your chart, which has to do with your profession and how you show up in public. So this is really important preparation work for that next phase. It's really giving you the grounding that you will need to navigate these other parts of life. So it's a little bit of an initiation feeling to it, right? It's a little bit of it's a challenging place. When eighth house is always talked about in terms of difficulties and challenges. So don't want to sugarcoat it, but at the same time, you can trust that it's worthwhile lessons, very, very useful lessons for future things. So.
Yeah, and Saturn moving through the eighth house can bring up some difficult issues in managing yourself in the face of other people's stuff, for sure. Okay. Are we ready to move on?
Let's do it.
Okay. So for those of you with Virgo rising, this puts Saturn moving into your 7th house. One thing I want to say about Saturn moving into the 7th house is it's the first time, for 14 years, Saturn's been moving below the surface of the chart. So at this point, Saturn moves into Pisces and it comes up over the horizon. It's like, in some ways, your authority is coming into public view. So that's an important thing to think about as well. You've been underground, doing a lot of work underground for 14 long years. Okay, now it's time to bring that out into a more public arena. But before we go too much into that Saturn in the 7th house, I want you to think about and ask yourself, what have you learned over the last 3 years in terms of how you navigate your day-to-day routines, how you manage your work life, your exercise, your feeding yourself, all these day-to-day routines of your life. How have you managed that? Health issues. What have you learned in that area? Because now you're ready to, you've gotten some sort of a gift from that. You're feeling a lot more solid with where you are in your routines. Now it's time to take that into the realm of relationship. Now, I remember, I'm going to just throw this out there because I always think of it. I think I probably read it in a book when I was 20, that when Saturn moves into the 7th house, during the process of Saturn going through the 7th house, people either get married or they get divorced. It's like, and that's clearly, that's not true. But it often does happen that people either get married or get divorced, because the process of Saturn moving through the 7th house is learning what you really need in relationship. If you're in a bad relationship, it's time for you to move out of that situation. If you're in a good relationship, it's time for you to stabilize it. So this is a time of really getting clear about what you need in partnership. And that's going to be in intimate partnerships, in work partnerships. It can even include things like your astrologer or your therapist, or, those kind of one-on-one relationships. It's time to really get clear what works and what doesn't work. Now, how does the counterpoint of the full moon, what the counterpoint of the full moon is going to give us is a little bit of a practical skill that we can use to start this process, this school of relationship. What's the practical skill with that Virgo moon in the 1st house, Jennie?
In a word, it's self-awareness.
Yeah.
Because you need to understand yourself, how you are in relationship with yourself in order to be a partner. I mean, if you show up and you don't know who you are, and you don't know much about the image you project, and you don't know how much, you don't really understand the mirroring effect that kind of happens in relationships, it's going to get really messy really quickly, especially with Pisces on the 7th house. I mean, there's a tendency to idealize relationships with Pisces on the 7th house. So this is a very important time. This Virgo full moon really brings in that idea of, what do I need to do to develop my self-awareness? Like what sorts of practices do I need to work with? Because it's very tangible. It's an earth awareness. It's an understanding of how your emotions land in your physical body, so we're thinking about physical things. And we're also thinking about practical steps. So if you're like, self-awareness, I'm not really sure. I mean, your first step might be to do a little read up on your self-help books that obviously you've got on your shelf. So
if you've got Virgo rising, you've got self-help books on your shelf.
Yes, totally. So, I mean, it's a good time to work with that. And that's the counterpoint it brings in, because if you're looking to your partner to do all these things for you, to be a certain person, to be a certain way, like, your dreams are going to get dashed, because that's not, you've got to decide what kind of partner you want to be, and show up to that relationship with that understanding. And that's what this really illustrates to a T.
Yeah.
So,
and again, well, first I've got to just say something funny, because it popped into my mind. Anyone with Virgo rising having self-help books on their shelf. I remember way back in the day, I was probably in my 20s reading astrology books. And I remember reading that people with Virgo rising love catalogs. Catalogs don't even exist anymore because everything's online, but we used to get all these catalogs in the, Virgo rising. But again, wherever Saturn moves, we want to, what are the 3 things? Face reality, be accountable, take responsibility. So when Saturn moves into Pisces, your 7th house, you got to face reality. What are your relationships? What are they? Because like Jennie said, if you've got Pisces on that line, you might be totally, you've got your rose-colored glasses on, you've got that person up on a pedestal, but this is time that you have to face reality, because the reason you've got those rose-colored glasses on is because you have a dream. There's a dream in your head and in your heart of what a relationship can be for you. And if you want, right, romance, and if you want that dream to be a reality, this is a 3-year period of time where you can really put the structure in. It might not be easy. You might not be able to make it happen with the partner you're with right now. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But this is the time to get clear about that and to get clear that it is your responsibility to do the work to put the structures in place. And in 3 years, when that Saturn moves into the 8th house, you'll really know what boundaries to set.
Yeah. And also, I know Laurie's been mentioning, you've been mentioning that time period of 1993 to 1997 as a reference point. So if you're old enough for that period to be relevant, I mean, obviously, if you're a little child in that period, it's probably not going to be very helpful. But if you're older than that, think back to that time, because that's the last time Saturn was in Pisces and therefore in your 7th house. So when you think about that time, it gives you a reference point to think about what are the issues you've dealt with before, and also for you to see your own growth. Right. You know, because you can probably see where you were in that time period of relationships. And I really hope it's different 30 years later. Right. But you can probably see some common threads. Yeah. But also hopefully be able to look at your evolution, which is so important, because Saturn is about growth. And it's not the easy growth. It's the hard growth. But there's a lot of fruit to be gained for your labor. So.
Yeah. And on a very personal level, this is my setup. And between 1993 and 97, I got a divorce. I went through a very, very difficult time around relationship that ended in divorce. Does that mean that my current intimate partnership has to end this time? No, it doesn't mean that. It does mean that I best take things seriously. You know, if you can look at the cycle where you were last time, it can inform you a lot on how to work going forward. If you know you don't want to end up in the same situation you were in then, you've got tools. You've learned a lot over the past, almost 30 years. Hopefully you've learned something. Hopefully.
Yeah. And that full moon shines a really bright light on what exactly that is, and can give you probably a pretty tangible understanding of what went wrong last time, you know, like it gives you an understanding, and where am I now, and what practical steps, you know, what's the missing gap right now. And with that full moon, you have a little window to see that super clearly in that little time period. So take advantage.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's, I'm excited. I'm excited about Saturn moving through that house and really taking on this the idea of materializing your dreams, of really creating that solid state within the dream space. Nice. Okay, so now we're going to move on to those of you with Libra rising. This is going to put your Saturn moving into your 6th house. So before we talk about Saturn moving into the 6th house, we want you to ask yourself, those of you with Libra rising, ask yourself, what have you learned over the past 2.5 to 3 years around how you give of yourself? Whether that be your creativity, you know, your lessons over the last 2.5 or 3 years may have come from creativity, from children, relationships with children. It's generally where you give of yourself most directly. So what have you learned there? And how do the gifts of that learning come now into your day-to-day routines? The next 3 years, you're stepping now into this state of the next 3 years, you learn how to manage your day-to-day routines, and you bring the understanding of how you give of yourself into that. I think of this as, you know, maybe you had a baby while Saturn was moving through your 5th house. You had a child, and now, you know, you just have to incorporate that into the day-to-day routines of your life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you're on that path of that learning. You know, the sixth house is brings in issues of healthcare, your dietary, your exercise issues, your routines of your life.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you're saying routines, it's like, oh, it's kind of dry. But you know what? With Pisces in your sixth house, you're someone who needs to find some flow. You need some flow. I mean, I think Pisces symbolizes that inward flow, and it's a water sign. And so it does refer to that. So anyone with Libra rising, there's got to be some kind of flow to how you take care of yourself, whether that's a physical pursuit, like I always think about snowboarding through, you know, in the powder, or it could be more of a water thing or whatever. There's certainly other ways, but it really is finding that creative flow that's gonna, it's this nice place. It's not a dry place. It's this really nice flowing place. And that's what you need to tap into to keep those routines, keep yourself healthy as a Libra rising person.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's very much while Saturn moves through there. It's like building structure to keep you healthy, keep your life moving forward. And
Very
then, what'd you say?
I said very helpful to have Saturn going into that area, I think.
Oh, it really is. It really is. As long as we're, you know, willing to do the work necessary. Because you can't, if you don't do the work necessary, you're going to have health problems. Now, in terms of the full moon, what this brings us to is, okay, what simple, practical task can we take on that will kind of kickstart this beginning of this 3-year cycle? What would that, with Virgo in the 12th house, what would that practical task be?
I think it's, I mean, the 12th house is tricky. You know, it's not so easy to explain, but I do think this is having an understanding of those normally hidden unconscious patterns that trip us up. You know, the habit that you have, you know, when you suddenly find yourself, let's say at the food cupboard eating a cookie and you don't even remember how you got there.
Right.
You know?
And maybe you're eating 12 of them.
Right. You know, so with the full moon there, it suggests this little window of being able to look into whatever that habit that drove you into that unconscious behavior. So not an easy one to talk about, but it is practical. It is maybe being able to stop and pause and witnessing like, ooh, what am I doing in my physical body right now? Because we're not always, the 12th house does not always easily lend itself to understanding what's happening with your body. But with the full moon there, I think it's a good question to ask yourself, like, how did I get here? Why am I standing in front of the cupboard eating cookies? Because it's a little tricky. But I think with Saturn moving into that 6th house, you are going to have to come to grips with some of those behaviors that drive your habits. You know, like if eating is an issue, which I know it is for very many people, eating disorders are huge. This is a time when confronting that, it might be really difficult, but to confront the underlying issues beyond that,
I think
to work
that's
with the fears, you know.
That's so great, Jenny. I'm so glad you brought that in, because this is a time with Saturn moving through the 6th house. You've got to contend with some of those hidden issues. So it's funny because with Virgo rising, we talked about self-help books. But I think there's something here too. You know, what is it? What is that unconscious pattern that you now need to understand in order to develop the proper routine habits? And again, wherever Saturn moves, we want to think about facing reality, being accountable, and taking responsibility. What is the reality of our routines today? What do we want it to be? How can we be accountable and take responsibility for making that a priority in our lives? And maybe you need to go to the self-help shelf at your bookstore there, or make an appointment with a therapist. There's something in that unconscious that can make it very difficult for us to do that process of stabilizing and working with those day-to-day routines.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, because Saturn, is often represented as this very difficult planet, and it is the teacher planet. But it's difficult because it forces us to confront the parts of ourselves that we're not so comfortable with, especially on the 6th and the 12th house axis as Libra rising, as you have. Like you're having to look at some things that it's not comfortable,
Right.
but it is for the greater good, for your growth, for you to be a more healthy, more whole person. I mean, that's
Right.
what this is going to bring in.
Yeah.
And also, like you've been bringing up that nice reference point, like if you're old enough
Yeah.
to have been an adult from 1993 to 1997, or even if you're a young adult, think back to that time. What did you learn in that window? Because that is the last time that Saturn was in your sixth house. What did it bring up? And now, if you're watching this video, you're tuning into astrology. So you have this conscious opportunity to work with this in a new way. Not only are you older, but you're having this awareness about it. So
Yeah.
good time to think about what went on to do with your health and routines at that time. 93
Right.
to 90.
Right. Did you think about that. What happened during that period of time? Were there health concerns? Were there problems with whatever, the routines, the dietary stuff, the exercise stuff? Did you try to take on a learning there? And how did it work for you then? What support did you utilize at that time? What do you need now? Because now you're at the same point, but at a higher level. That's how I think about it. I mean, these are just cycles and cycles. And in another 29 years, you'll be back to this point again. And what you learn now will support you at that time. Another thing that I want you to think about is that in 3 years' time, approximately, Saturn will be going over the 7th house cusp. And that is a really important time because Saturn's been below the horizon in your chart for many years now. And when it goes in 3 years into the 7th house, it's coming out into a more public sphere. So what you want to be thinking about as Saturn's approaching for the next 3 years, that 7th house cusp, you're really preparing for coming out into the public. These day-to-day routines are ultimately part of their purpose. Yes, it's to support your health, but it's to support your health so that you can go out into the world and really be in relationship with people in a deeper way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Great.
That's the work. Get on it. Get on it. Okay.
All
now,
right.
We're going to move on to those of you with Scorpio rising. Now, if you have Scorpio rising, Saturn is now moving into your 5th house. Now, before we talk a lot about that, I want you to think about and ask yourself, what have you learned over the past 2.5 to 3 years? What have you learned around home and family? What has that process been like for you? How have you stabilized your relationships with your family or stabilized your living situation? That area now should be pretty well stabilized. And now Saturn moves into this 5th house, which is the house of creativity, of where you give of yourself. It can be about children, about love affairs, about creative projects. So possibly, you've stabilized your home life and now you're ready to have a child. Or maybe you've stabilized your home life and now you have space in your home to develop creative projects, whatever it is. So you want to think Saturn's going to be moving through that house for 3 years. What do you need to learn about your own creativity, your own ability to give? What do you need to learn over the next 3 years?
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and how is the counterpoint of the full moon helpful in the beginning of this process?
Mm-hmm. I really like how you brought the home life into that and just thinking about liberating yourself to express your creative pursuits.
Oh, I like
and
that.
Doing it in a structured way with Saturn there. It's like, okay, and finally like really use that art studio. Now the kids have moved out.
Right,
right. Something like that. But I really like the counterpoint of the full moon too. Like I think that's a really interesting point because what the full moon is bringing in is awareness, a little window of time, because the moon moves very quickly, to really have an understanding about how you receive love. Because the 5th house is such a focus on the giving of love, right? But I think about that full moon as really brings in practical concerns about your community.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And what tasks and practical awareness. Yeah. If you think about that Virgo full moon, bringing an awareness of the task that you can take on now that will support the effort of building this more structured creativity. Mm-hmm. So what task would we think of? I think it's just really about finding that community or having some connection to community that will support you in your creativity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, with Scorpio rising, it's like you're going to have the ability to bring some skills and practical skills, I guess, to your community. So there's a connection. I was thinking almost it's like you're finally have space in your house to do your pottery, and then you need to go into the community and figure out, I'd like to figure out how to sell my to sell my art, said that wrong, with my community. So, what can I build? I mean, maybe there's other folks in your community who like to do art. So you want to figure out how to join a farmer's market together or something like that. Yeah. I mean, is this some kind of interaction here between your boundless dream of creative pursuits and then the very practical, and how do you bring that to your community? Yeah. It's something about that. So
taking some action in community that will support the growth and stabilization of your creativity.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I
love that.
Also, for reference. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I just love thinking about Saturn moving through. Normally I don't think of Saturn moving through the fifth house as a great thing, because it's like the fifth house. One of the things about the fifth house is it's where we have fun. And Saturn is like, oh, you've got to be structured. You have to kind of create structure in order to have fun. Mm-hmm. And I don't think of that as a lot of fun. But when you think about how free-flowing Pisces is, a little bit of structure here will help get that paint on the canvas rather than just having it all out there in your mind.
Right, because this can be how you set the schedule. You go buy the materials, you set the schedule, and then you bring in the Pisces free-flowing, imaginative, whatever, between the hours of 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock. But it allows you to do it, because if you never set the time, you never make it into the room. Yeah. So.
Exactly. And again, I'm going to bring up what I keep saying is 3 things with Saturn. Wherever Saturn moves, face reality, be accountable, and take responsibility. So first of all, Saturn moves in there. Face reality. Where is my creativity at? And then build the structure, taking accountability, being responsible for building in that schedule, like Jennie said. This is a powerful time, I think, for Scorpio rising. This is a powerful time for creativity. And it may not be, creativity is a funny word, because I remember years ago saying, I don't have a creative bone in my body. And really believing that, because somewhere in my mind, creativity meant, I don't know, painting or something. Creativity is a big thing. It is that fifth house. It is how we give of ourselves. That's really what it is. And it can be painting. It can be music. It can be, raising your children. It can be all kinds of things, but it's how you give of yourself. And to think about Pisces, that just beautiful, expansive, unboundaried area, having enough structure to make it real.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful.
Perfect.
I love thinking about that. That's okay.
Great. All right.
I think we're ready to move on to those of you with Sagittarius rising.
All right.
With Sagittarius rising, Saturn is moving into your 4th house. This is a significant movement, isn't it, Jennie? Oof.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So before we really think about Saturn moving into that 4th house, let's think about where it's been. For the past 2.5 or 3 years, it's been going through your third house. And I want you to think about what gifts you have received, what you have learned while Saturn moved through that third house. Third house, communication, possibly relationships with siblings, cousins, neighbors, that kind of thing. But mostly it's about communication. I know when Saturn moved through my third house was when I went crazy and wrote a book that has never been published. But I learned an awful lot about how my mind works, what I think about. It was a very powerful time. And it really, it left its gifts, which Saturn does. So now, just take on that awareness of what you've learned over these 3 years and bringing that into the fourth house. As Saturn moves in there, you want to think about what it is you need to learn in the area of home and family.
Yeah. I think of this as an opportunity to create an important structure around your home life that allows, like if you create that container that Saturn suggests, it's going to allow that free flow of energy that Pisces suggests. So it's how do you anchor, I'm just really thinking about your family life. How do you anchor that, create a container around that so that there can be a really lovely free flow of creative energy, of that watery Pisces energy within the home life. I think it's going to be helpful. I mean, with Pisces in that fourth house, it can feel pretty nebulous and confusing at times. But with Saturn in there, it's just going to allow you to create a whole bunch more stability and embrace the more empathetic, indescribable parts of Pisces as well. So
I think about, wherever Pisces is being the place where you have this big dream. And, maybe you have a dream of your home being, I don't know, some retreat center or something, and it can stay in that space of dreaminess forever. Whatever it is, the dream of what your family could be or what your home could be. And now Saturn moves in there. It is ready to build the structure, because that dream is nothing without some structure around it, right? A dream, you know what happens with dreams when you wake up in the morning, they're gone, like boom, they're gone, unless you've created some sort of structure to capture them. And then you have something tangible. So Saturn wants to make your dream tangible. That's its job. So tell me about that counterpoint. I'm going to just let you tell me about that counterpoint of the full moon for a minute.
Yeah, it's so remarkable to have Saturn moving into Pisces right at almost at the same moment. I mean, within an hour of the full moon in Virgo, because it really brings in this counterpoint. I mean, the full moon is shining in your 10th house of career and profession, for those of you with Sagittarius rising. So this is where you get to kind of have that tangible counterpoint, as you said, to this area of your home life where you're going to be learning these new lessons about empathy and compassion in your home life. That Virgo full moon is sort of like, hey, what tasks do you need to do right now in your profession that adds to the stability of whatever that home life is? Because if you think about it, you can't really ever think about your work life without also thinking about your home life. Right. I mean, they're the two sides of the same coin. I mean, where do you go when you're finished with your work day? Even if you work at home, you exit your office and you go into your house, the rest of your house. So there's a real interplay between the two things. And they kind of are a reflection of each other. So there's this opportunity for both stability and an embracing a more emotional context in both those areas of your life, in your profession and in your home life. If that makes sense.
It's sort of, I think of it as, in order to structure the dream of your home, you have to have that practical foot in the world. You have to have connections out in the world as well. And I've been talking a lot with these about when Saturn moves into a new area, we need to think about first of all, facing reality, being accountable, and taking responsibility. So facing the reality, and wherever Pisces is, it's not always easy to face reality. We don't necessarily understand reality where Pisces is, because we've got our rose-colored glasses on, everything's beautiful, or everything's, confusing, one or the other. Saturn moves in there, and it's like, you got to really look clearly. Saturn will push you to, as the authoritative teacher, Saturn's going to say, okay, look at reality here. And you want to really take that on, because fighting against it isn't going to be helpful. So facing reality, is the roof about ready to cave in on your house? Do you need to, put your resources into the home itself? Do you need to go visit your elderly mother? What are the realities of your home and family that you really need to get serious about, be responsible around family members? This is an important, very important area.
Yeah, and you have to think about how they support each other, which I think is really interesting, is that interplay. Yeah. And for a reference point, for those of you who are old enough, if you think back to 1993 to 1997, that was the last time Saturn was in Pisces, and therefore in your fourth house. So think back to that time for a reference point. Right. What was going on in your life at that time? Because it can give you some clues. Two things. It can give you clues about what this next cycle might be about for you, and it also gives you a reference point to see what your growth has been. This 30 years ago is a while ago. Like, what have you evolved to be at this point? I mean, Saturn refers to growth, so that's really what we are looking at. So
what did you learn during that period of time? How are those lessons similar but on a different level now? What is it that you're going to learn during this time? And, whenever I see Saturn moving into the fourth house, I always think, a lot of people move during that time. They do a renovation on their house, or they move to a new home, or, something about the home and family is really changing in a big way. Kids move out, kids move back home, different things like that. But it's an important time. So make sure you've got the practicality of your outer world in support of the efforts and learning you're doing at home.
Right.
Ready? Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And now we're going to move on to those of you with Capricorn rising. And this puts Saturn moving into your third house. Before we dive into what that's all about, I want you to ask yourself what you learned over the past 2.5 to 3 years, what you learned as Saturn moved through your second house. The second house is the house of money, resources, your own self-worth. What have you learned during that period of time? Because now that Saturn's moving out of that area, the gifts of that learning come into the third house. The gifts, what you've learned about your self-worth, enables you to take on the learning of basically how to communicate. Saturn moving through the third house is really going to teach you a lot about communication.
And it's also an opportunity to, really wrestle with the idea of having more authority in your voice. I mean, with Pisces in the third house, it may well feel to you that your voice has been an area of struggle, an area where you haven't been able to speak up, because with Pisces there, it's not very clear. And I think it invites a lot of judgment too. Like if you're a person who's able to speak about emotions and empathy, let's say, it invites judgment, because we live in a culture that doesn't really value that a whole lot. So with Saturn moving into that, it gives you an opportunity to take more authority in that area and trust, that you are in good stature when you do that, that you're doing the work. You've done the self-worth work from Saturn before, and now you're able to kind of step into that with more confidence. So that's what my hope is for those of you with Capricorn rising.
That you take on that task, that job over the next 3 years of really becoming bringing your voice to a place of authority, becoming the authority with your voice. Yeah. And in thinking about the counterpoint of that moon, which is just so fascinating that it happens right, within the same hour of Saturn moving into Pisces, we've got this Virgo full moon. And this really helps us to see, okay, how do we start this process? What's the best practical task to begin this process of getting serious and clear about how to use your voice? And that, let's see, what would that task be?
Well, I think the 3rd and the 9th together are so much about, it's so much about learning, so there's something here with that moon about where you are able to take on other people's viewpoints. You're able to listen and take in other people's viewpoints. And I think that's actually a pretty tangible skill. In terms of like, what do you need to do to listen? You need to sort of quiet yourself and focus your attention on the other person, right? So that it's actually quite a very tangible skill when you really think about it.
Oh, that's awesome.
About that. Yeah, I like that. Because the 9th house is your critical thinking, your worldview, and all those things, but and also your beliefs, but it's not skillful to be dogmatic and to be just stuck in like parroting other viewpoints. So this is the skill comes in from really having your own point of view and taking in other people's points of views as well, and like being able to walk that tricky little line.
Right. That's very interesting. And the thing also to think about here, wherever Saturn moves, you need to face reality, be accountable, and take responsibility. I feel like I'm a broken record saying that over and over. But Saturn moving into the 3rd house, it really is, really facing the reality of how strong is your voice? How confident are you in speaking up and saying what's right for you? And, in all probability, facing that reality is going to be a little bit challenging because your voice may not be as strong as you need it to be. That's why Saturn's here, to strengthen that voice over the next few years. So really facing reality, looking at it clearly, and starting the work of developing a stronger voice. And with Pisces there, start writing some poetry. That's the other thing I think about, read poetry, listen to music. That Pisces in that 3rd house is, the voice is poetic in a way. So this really can stabilize a voice that's not very Capricornian, actually, which can be a little challenging. In 3 years' time, Saturn will be going into your 4th house. So you've got this 3 years to develop your voice before Saturn goes into the area where it's going to be very strongly making statements about your home and family, changes in that area. So let's see, what else are we thinking about?
I think the only other thing is just, there's a reference point here from 1993 to 1997. If you're old enough to have been an adult during that time, refer back to that time. Think about that time, because that's the last time that Saturn was in Pisces and the last time it was in your 3rd house. So what was going on in this time? Like what was the learning that was happening? It being Saturn and it being the 3rd house, this is very important to your learning and your overall mindset that you have now. So think about that and use that as a reference point. So
and even if you were a child, sometimes it can be pretty interesting. If you were a child and Saturn was moving through that 3rd house, it was very much about school. And now where are you at with that kind of learning? It's pretty interesting to think back and watch that cycle go around and around. So almost 30 years ago, Saturn was moving through this area. In another 29 or 30 years, Saturn will be back in this area. And each time you're learning deeper and more significant lessons about how you use your voice. So pay attention. Okay.
All right.
So now we're going to move on to those of you with Aquarius rising, and this puts Saturn's movement into your second house. Before we talk about the second house, let's think about where Saturn's been. For the past 2.5 or 3 years, Saturn's been moving through your first house. That's a very personal job. You have been learning who you are. Bottom line, who am I? While Saturn moves through the first house, there's a lot of really understanding how you show up in the world as a direct personality, not your deep inner unconscious, but just how you show up in the world as a personality. So with that learning, you come into Saturn moving into the second house with a pretty clear understanding of who you are. Now you want to think in terms of your self-worth. Now that you know who you are, what are you worth? For the next 3 years, you're going to be really asking yourself that question. What am I worth? You're going to be looking at your finances, your resources, and just your self-esteem. That's where a lot of your learning is. So what do you need to learn there? What skills will help you at this very beginning point, just as Saturn steps in there? This full moon, this Virgo full moon, kind of gives us that counterpoint of what tasks can support the beginning of this process.
Yeah, I really like this with that full moon there. Again, it gives you that little counterpoint, as you're saying, this little window into what kinds of things you might do. And in this case, it's always that the self and other. I mean, that's a fundamental truth of being human. And in this case, you're looking at how you navigate those difficult relationships and things with other people, how you navigate when somebody shows up and they're super emotionally triggered and you're like, whoa, how do I handle this? You're really getting to take a look at that with this full moon right in that 8th house. I think the simplest way I think about it is make sure you've got some rituals. Like, so maybe if you do happen to have a meditation practice, for example, this is a good time to maybe bring in something more tangible. I mean, I have a little yoga space, and you can bring in something that, I mean, even like a rock that means something to you. That's something tangible that gives you a ritual around how you're going to walk through the world on that particular day. And it's something that's immediately practical. It's immediately, you can apply it right now. You may have many other variations on the theme, but think in terms of ritual. What thing would help you remember to stay grounded when intense things happen around you that are really to do with other people's emotions, not so much yours? Right. So that's what the skill is. It's a little bit tricky one to discuss and talk about, but I think that touchstone of a simple ritual can help you find ground.
I think that's very practical, especially if you've got Aquarius rising, that whole area of ritual and just understanding how to navigate other people's issues in order to then understand and work with yourself.
Yeah, it's a two-way street. I mean, there's no like guidebook around step one, do it this way with yourself, and then you have to do it, you know, you're building the plane while you're flying it.
Yeah, I love that.
You know?
I love that.
So how you are in relationship gives you a really good reflection of how you value yourself, and those are the topics we're really working with. And I really like how, Laurie, you've been saying so much about how Saturn's a reality check. How do you need to take responsibility for yourself in the part of your life that refers to your self-worth? Yeah. You know, this is the time to take that on and to be serious about how you value yourself.
How you value yourself and how you manage your resources, whether that's your money or, you know, whatever, your stuff. But this, you know, Saturn moving through the second house is not easy. Well, Saturn is a challenge everywhere it goes. Let's face it. That's its purpose, is to challenge us in order for us to grow and develop the container. So, you know, you might have with Pisces there on the second house, you might have this dream of being really wealthy. Or on the other hand, you might have a dream of how, you know, spiritual it is to be poverty stricken. Either way, this, you know, with Pisces there, you can hold one of those attitudes around money and resources, but pay attention to how money and your self-worth are connected, because they're so tightly connected. And during this time, you know, how you manage money and resources is going to really change. You're going to learn an awful lot. And yeah, when Saturn first moves in there, face the reality of what your situation is and put the structure around it.
Yeah, and easier said than done. This is a hard, I think this is a hard movement for Saturn. But hence just dig into that ritual. Find the one that works for you. So
yeah, absolutely. I love that. Oh, and the one thing I don't think we talked about yet for Aquarius rising is to think back between 1993 and 97, if you're old enough for that to be a meaningful period of time. Think about what was going on in your life in regards to money, resources, self-worth between 93 and 97, because that was the last time Saturn was in this position. You were learning a lot about this area then. You're back here again. There's probably some reflections that you can see from that time to now. And whatever you learned then, you've got another opportunity to learn the higher level of that. So you're kind of building on what you learned at that time.
Nice.
All right. Moving on.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Jennie, we're moving on to those of you with Pisces rising. So if you've got Pisces rising, Saturn is moving right into your first house. This is super, super personal for you. Before we talk about that, let's think about and ask yourself, over the last 3 years, what have you learned around your own unconscious patterns? With Saturn in the last 2.5 to 3 years moving through your 12th house, you've been on a study course of your own unconscious mind. What have you learned? And what are you now bringing? The gift of that study comes into your personality now. And over the next 3 years, approximately, Saturn is going to teach you a lot about how to bring that understanding into developing a more cohesive, solid personality.
Nice. Mm-hmm. I think this is a pretty big deal because for the past 14 years, Saturn's been above the horizon from you. So that means that for these last 14 years, it's been very outward. This is about how you work out of the world, how you work with, you know, your partners through your career. And now there's a little bit of a rebirthy feel to Saturn going into your first house. It's a little bit of like you've completed that entire cycle and now it's time to start again. And so that's why it has to do with your identity and your development of self, because it's a new time to work with that. And of course, during this full moon, we also have the very interesting counterpoint where you want to ask yourself, what is the task that I can do right now in the short term that can have an impact on my self-awareness? And it's going to have to do with your partnerships, because our partnerships are sort of, I mean, they're mirrors in a lot of ways. So you're getting that mirrored back at you of like, how do you show up in this practical way in your important one-on-one partnerships? What do you think about that, Virgo?
Well, I think that's really interesting to just think about that counterpoint of that full moon, you know, coming just almost at the same time as Saturn entering Pisces. That counterpoint, it's like there's a task that you can do right now that will help support this this development of a more solid understanding of self. So the task is to in some way be of service to someone else. I think that's the task that starts this process. You know, that whole mirroring thing you talked about, it's like you be of service to them and it reflects back to your own understanding of working with yourself. And I love that you brought up the 14-year cycle. And yeah, so the Saturn has now gone below the surface. The next 14 years, you're going to be learning deeper, more internal lessons rather than out in the world lessons. You're going to be learning for this 3 years, you're learning about who you are. This is a very, very important time. And, you know, whatever your idea, your fantasy, your dream about how you show up in the world, Saturn's going to help you structure that and figure out how to express that in a way that's not, I don't know, either too flighty or too passive. It's going to give you a little more structure on that, on how you show up in the world.
And this, I mean, Saturn always brings lessons. I mean, really is the great teacher planet, but it's difficult, it's challenging, and you may have to face things in your personality that you're not all that huge a fan with, that you really would rather not have. But it's all about taking that, facing it, integrating it, welcoming it in as part of who you are. And as you do that, you're going to be able to show up in that partner space that is represented by the full moon here in a much more balanced way. You're going to have much more to offer to your relationship as you do that. So not to say that it's going to be easy, but that growth is necessary. And the things that we grow through, those really hard things, we often look back at those and remember how they really showed us what we're made of. So it's kind of one of those time periods. Yeah. So absolutely.
I think it's great. I mean, it's a real time to stabilize how you show up in the world.
Yeah.
That's bottom line. So the other thing to think about here is, if you're old enough for it to make a difference, think about 1993 to 97. That was the last time Saturn was in this position. Think about what that time meant to you. What did you learn throughout the course of that time about yourself, about who you are? And that will inform you of where you are now in a lot of ways. If that was a super hard time for you, you want to think about, how you could have done it different, how you could have learned these lessons quicker. You'll learn them quicker this time anyway, because you're the second pass around. Or the third, if you're old enough to have gone through this twice. But this is a really, really important time in the development of who you are, how you show up in the world. So do the work, enjoy it, take it on.
All right.
All right. Are we all set, Jennie?
Yes, I think we're completed. So
okay.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Jennie, for this fun and delightful conversation. And we'll keep doing these videos. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Laurie.